Chapter 3. The owner of the medieval castle was an Englishman, a Mr. Briggs, who was in London at the moment, and wrote that it had beds enough for 8 people, exclusive of servants, 3 sitting rooms, battlements, dungeons, and electric light. The rent was £60 for the month, the servants' wages were extra, and he wanted references. He wanted assurances that the second half of his rent would be paid, the first half being paid in advance, and he wanted assurances of respectability from a solicitor or a doctor or a clergyman. He was very polite in his letter, explaining that his desire for references was what was usual and should be regarded as a mere formality. Mrs. Arbuthnot and Mrs. Wilkins had not thought of references, and they had not dreamed a rent could be so high. In their minds had floated sums like 3 guineas a week, or less, seeing that the place was small and old. £60 for a single month. It staggered them. Before Mrs. Arbuthnot's eyes rose up boots, endless vistas, all the stout boots that £60 would buy, and besides the rent there would be the servants' wages and the food and the railway journeys out and home. While as for references, these did indeed seem a stumbling block. It did seem impossible to give any without making their plan more public than they had intended. They had both. Even Mrs. Arbuthnot, lured for once away from perfect candor by the realization of the great saving of trouble and criticism an imperfect explanation would produce. They had both thought it would be a good plan to give out, each to her own circle, their circles being luckily distinct, that each was going to stay with a friend who had a house in Italy. It would be true as far as it went. Mrs. Wilkins asserted that it would be quite true, but Mrs. Arbuthnot thought it wouldn't be quite, and it was the only way, Mrs. Wilkins said, to keep Mellersh even approximately quiet. To spend any of her money just on the mere getting to Italy would cause him indignation. What he would say if he knew she was renting part of a medieval castle on her own account. Mrs. Wilkins preferred not to think. It would take him days to say it all, and this, although it was her very own money, and not a penny of it had ever been his. "But I expect," she said, "your husband is just the same. I expect all husbands are alike in the long run." Mrs. Arbuthnot said nothing, because her reason for not wanting Frederick to know was the exactly opposite one. Frederick would be only too pleased for her to go. He would not mind it in the very least. Indeed, he would hail such a manifestation of self-indulgence and worldliness with an amusement that would hurt, and urge her to have a good time and not to hurry home with a crushing detachment. Far better, she thought, to be missed by Mellersh than to be sped by Frederick. To be missed, to be needed, from whatever motive, was, she thought, better than the complete loneliness of not being missed or needed at all. She therefore said nothing, and allowed Mrs. Wilkins to leap at her conclusions unchecked. But they did, both of them, for a whole day feel that the only thing to be done was to renounce the medieval castle, and it was in arriving at this bitter decision that they really realized how acute had been their longing for it. Then Mrs. Arbuthnot, whose mind was trained in the finding of ways out of difficulties, found a way out of the reference difficulty, and simultaneously Mrs. Wilkins had a vision revealing to her how to reduce the rent. Mrs. Arbuthnot's plan was simple and completely successful. She took the whole of the rent in person to the owner, drawing it out of her savings bank. Again she looked furtive and apologetic, as if the clerk must know the money was wanted for purposes of self-indulgence. And, going up with the 6 10-pound notes in her handbag to the address near the Brompton Oratory where the owner lived, presented them to him, waiving her right to pay only half. And when he saw her, and her parted hair and soft dark eyes and sober apparel, and heard her grave voice, he told her not to bother about writing round for those references. "It'll be all right," he said, scribbling a receipt for the rent. "Do sit down, won't you? Nasty day, isn't it? You'll find the old castle has lots of sunshine, whatever else it hasn't got. Husband going?" Mrs. Arbuthnot, unused to anything but candor, looked troubled at this question and began to murmur inarticulately, and the owner at once concluded that she was a widow. a war won, of course, for other widows were old, and that he had been a fool not to guess it. "Oh, I'm sorry," he said, turning red right up to his fair hair. "I didn't mean, He ran his eye over the receipt he had written. "Yes, I think that's all right," he said, getting up and giving it to her. "Now," he added, taking the 6 notes she held out and smiling, for Mrs. Arbuthnot was agreeable to look at, "I'm richer and you're happier. I've got money and you've got San Salvatore. I wonder which is best." "I think you know," said Mrs. Arbuthnot with her sweet smile. He laughed and opened the door for her. It was a pity the interview was over. He would have liked to ask her to lunch with him. She made him think of his mother, of his nurse, of all things kind and comforting, besides having the attraction of not being his mother or his nurse. "I hope you like the old place," he said, holding her hand a minute at the door. The very feel of her hand, even through its glove, was reassuring. It was the sort of hand, he thought, that children would like to hold in the dark. In April, you know, it's simply a mass of flowers, and then there's the sea. You must wear white. You'll fit in very well. There are several portraits of you there." "Portraits?" "Madonnas, you know. There's one on the stairs really exactly like you." Mrs. Arbuthnot smiled and said goodbye and thanked him, without the least trouble, and at once she had got him placed in his proper category. He was an artist and of an effervescent temperament. She shook hands and left, and he wished she hadn't. After she was gone, he supposed that he ought to have asked for those references, if only because she would think him so unbusinesslike not to, but he could as soon have insisted on references from a saint in a nimbus as from that grave, sweet lady. Rose Arbuthnot, her letter, making the appointment, lay on the table. Pretty name. That difficulty, then, was overcome. But there still remained the other one, the really annihilating effect of the expense on the nest eggs, and especially on Mrs. Wilkins's, which was in size, compared with Mrs. Arbuthnot's, as the egg of the plover to that of the duck. And this, in its turn, was overcome by the vision vouchsafed to Mrs. Wilkins, revealing to her the steps to be taken for its overcoming, having got San Salvatore. The beautiful, the religious name fascinated them. They, in their turn, would advertise in the agony column of the Times, and would inquire after 2 more ladies of similar desires to their own to join them and share the expenses. At once the strain of the nest eggs would be reduced from half to a quarter. Mrs. Wilkins was prepared to fling her entire egg into the adventure, but she realized that if it were to cost even 6 pence over her £90, her position would be terrible. Imagine going to Mellersh and saying, "I owe." It would be awful enough if some day circumstances forced her to say, "I have no nest egg," but at least she would be supported in such a case by the knowledge that the egg had been her own. She therefore, though prepared to fling her last penny into the adventure, was not prepared to fling into it a single farthing that was not demonstrably her own, and she felt that if her share of the rent was reduced to £15 only, she would have a safe margin for the other expenses. Also, they might economize very much on food, gather olives off their own trees and eat them, for instance, and perhaps catch fish. Of course, as they pointed out to each other, they could reduce the rent to an almost negligible sum by increasing the number of sharers. They could have 6 more ladies instead of 2 if they wanted to, seeing that there were 8 beds. But supposing the 8 beds were distributed in couples in 4 rooms, it would not be altogether what they wanted, to find themselves shut up at night with a stranger. Besides, they thought that perhaps having so many would not be quite so peaceful. After all, they were going to San Salvatore for peace and rest and joy, and 6 more ladies, especially if they got into one's bedroom, might a little interfere with that. Speech first. However, there seemed to be only 2 ladies in England at that moment who had any wish to join them, for they had only 2 answers to their advertisement. "Well, we only want 2, said Mrs. Wilkins, quickly recovering, for she had imagined a great rush. "I think a choice would have been a good thing," said Mrs. Arbuthnot. "You mean because then we needn't have had Lady Caroline Dester?" "I didn't say that," gently protested Mrs. Arbuthnot. "We needn't have her," said Mrs. Wilkins. "Just one more person would help us a great deal with the rent. We're not obliged to have two. But why should we not have her? She seems really quite what we want." "Yes, she does from her letter," said Mrs. Wilkins doubtfully. She felt she would be terribly shy of Lady Caroline. Incredible as it may seem, seeing how they get into everything, Mrs. Wilkins had never come across any members of the aristocracy. They interviewed Lady Caroline, and they interviewed the other applicant, a Mrs. Fisher. Lady Caroline came to the club in Shaftesbury Avenue and appeared to be wholly taken up by one great longing, a longing to get away from everybody she had ever known. When she saw the club and Mrs. Arbuthnot and Mrs. Wilkins, she was sure that here was exactly what she wanted. She would be in Italy, a place she adored. She would not be in hotels, places she loathed. She would not be staying with friends, persons she disliked, and she would be in the company of strangers who would never mention a single person she knew, for the simple reason that they had not, could not have, and would not come across them. She asked a few questions about the fourth woman and was satisfied with the answers. Mrs. Fisher, of Prince of Wales Terrace, a widow. She, too, would be unacquainted with any of her friends. Lady Caroline did not even know where Prince of Wales Terrace was. "It's in London," said Mrs. Arbuthnot. "Is it?" said Lady Caroline. It all seemed most restful. Mrs. Fisher was unable to come to the club because, she explained by letter, she could not walk without a stick. Therefore Mrs. Arbuthnot and Mrs. Wilkins went to her. "But if she can't come to the club, how can she go to Italy?" wondered Mrs. Wilkins aloud. "We shall hear that from her own lips," said Mrs. Arbuthnot. From Mrs. Fisher's lips they merely heard, in reply to delicate questioning, that sitting in trains was not walking about, and they knew that already. Except for the stick, however, she appeared to be a most desirable fourth. Quiet, educated, elderly. She was much older than they or Lady Caroline. Lady Caroline had informed them she was 28, but not so old as to have ceased to be active-minded. She was very respectable indeed, and still wore a complete suit of black, though her husband had died, she told them, 11 years before. Her house was full of signed photographs of illustrious Victorian dead, all of whom she said she had known when she was little. Her father had been an eminent critic, and in his house she had seen practically everybody who was anybody in letters and art. Carlyle had scowled at her, Matthew Arnold had held her on his knee, Tennyson had sonorously rallied her on the length of her pigtail. She animatedly showed them the photographs, hung everywhere on her walls, pointing out the signatures with her stick, and she neither gave any information about her own husband nor asked for any about the husbands of her visitors, which was the greatest comfort. Indeed, she seemed to think that they also were widows, for on inquiring who the fourth lady was to be, and being told it was a Lady Caroline Dester, she said, "Is she a widow too?" And on their explaining that she was not, because she had not yet been married, observed with abstracted amiability, "All in good time." But Mrs. Fisher's very abstractedness, and she seemed to be absorbed chiefly in the interesting people she used to know and in their memorial photographs, and quite a good part of the interview was taken up by reminiscent anecdote of Carlyle, Meredith, Matthew Arnold, Tennyson, and a host of others. Her very abstractedness was a recommendation. She only asked, she said, to be allowed to sit quiet in the sun and remember. That was all Mrs. Arbuthnot and Mrs. Wilkins asked of their sharers. It was their idea of a perfect sharer that she should sit quiet in the sun and remember, rousing herself on Saturday evenings sufficiently to pay her share. Mrs. Fisher was very fond, too, she said, of flowers, and once when she was spending a weekend with her father at Box Hill. "Who lived at Box Hill?" interrupted Mrs. Wilkins, who hung on Mrs. Fisher's reminiscences, intensely excited by meeting somebody who had actually been familiar with all the really and truly and undoubtedly great, actually seen them, heard them talking, touched them. Mrs. Fisher looked at her over the top of her glasses in some surprise. Mrs. Wilkins, in her eagerness to tear the heart out quickly of Mrs. Fisher's reminiscences, afraid that at any moment Mrs. Arbuthnot would take her away and she wouldn't have heard half, had already interrupted several times with questions which appeared ignorant to Mrs. Fisher. "Meredith, of course," said Mrs. Fisher rather shortly. "I remember a particular weekend," she continued. "My father often took me, but I always remembered this weekend particularly." "Did you know Keats?" eagerly interrupted Mrs. Wilkins. Mrs. Fisher, after a pause, said with sub-acid reserve that she had been unacquainted with both Keats and Shakespeare. "Oh, of course, how ridiculous of me," cried Mrs. Wilkins, flushing scarlet. "It's because," she floundered, "it's because the immortals somehow still seem alive, don't they? As if they were here, going to walk into the room in another minute. And one forgets they are dead. In fact, one knows perfectly well that they're not dead, not nearly so dead as you and I even now," she assured Mrs. Fisher, who observed her over the top of her glasses. "I thought I saw Keats the other day," Mrs. Wilkins incoherently proceeded, driven on by Mrs. Fisher's look over the top of her glasses. "In Hampstead, crossing the road in front of that house, you know, the house where he lived." Mrs. Arbuthnot said they must be going. Mrs. Fisher did nothing to prevent them. "I really thought I saw him," protested Mrs. Wilkins, appealing for belief first to one and then to the other, while waves of color passed over her face, and totally unable to stop because of Mrs. Fisher's glasses and the steady eyes looking at her over their tops. "I believe I did see him. He was dressed in a—" Even Mrs. Arbuthnot looked at her now, and in her gentlest voice said they would be late for lunch. It was at this point that Mrs. Fisher asked for references. She had no wish to find herself shut up for 4 weeks with somebody who saw things. It is true that there were 3 sitting rooms, besides the garden and the battlements at San Salvatore, so that there would be opportunities of withdrawal from Mrs. Wilkins, but it would be disagreeable to Mrs. Fisher, for instance, if Mrs. Wilkins were suddenly to assert that she saw Mr. Fisher. Mr. Fisher was dead. Let him remain so. She had no wish to be told he was walking about the garden. The only reference she really wanted, for she was much too old and firmly seated in her place in the world for questionable associates to matter to her, was one with regard to Mrs. Wilkins's health. Was her health quite normal? Was she an ordinary, everyday, sensible woman? Mrs. Fisher felt that if she were given even one address, she would be able to find out what she needed. So she asked for references, and her visitors appeared to be so much taken aback. Mrs. Wilkins, indeed, was instantly sobered, that she added, "It is usual." Mrs. Wilkins found her speech first. "But," she said, "aren't we the ones who ought to ask for some from you?" And this seemed to Mrs. Arbuthnot, too, the right attitude. Surely it was they who were taking Mrs. Fisher into their party, and not Mrs. Fisher who was taking them into it. For answer, Mrs. Fisher, leaning on her stick, went to the writing table and in a firm hand wrote down 3 names and offered them to Mrs. Wilkins. And the names were so respectable. More, they were so momentous, they were so nearly august, that just to read them was enough. The President of the Royal Academy, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and the Governor of the Bank of England. Who would dare disturb such personages in their meditations with inquiries as to whether a female friend of theirs was all she should be? "They have known me since I was little," said Mrs. Fisher. "Everybody seemed to have known Mrs. Fisher since or when she was little. I don't think references are nice things at all between ordinary decent women," burst out Mrs. Wilkins, made courageous by being, as she felt, at bay, for she very well knew that the only reference she could give without getting into trouble was Shoolbred, and she had little confidence in that, as it would be entirely based on Mellershe's fish. "We're not business people. We needn't distrust each other." And Mrs. Arbuthnot said, with a dignity that yet was sweet, "I'm afraid references do bring an atmosphere into our holiday plan that isn't quite what we want, and I don't think we'll take yours up or give you any ourselves, so that I suppose you won't wish to join us." And she held out her hand in good-bye. Then Mrs. Fisher, her gaze diverted to Mrs. Arbuthnot, who inspired trust and liking even in tube officials, felt that she would be idiotic to lose the opportunity of being in Italy in the particular conditions offered, and that she and this calm-browed woman between them would certainly be able to curb the other one when she had her attacks. So she said, taking Mrs. Arbuthnot's offered hand, "Very well, I waive references." She waived references. The two, as they walked to the station in Kensington High Street, could not help thinking that this way of putting it was lofty. Even Mrs. Arbuthnot, spendthrift of excuses for lapses, thought Mrs. Fisher might have used other words, and Mrs. Wilkins, by the time she got to the station, and the walk and the struggle on the crowded pavement with other people's umbrellas had warmed her blood, actually suggested waiving Mrs. Fisher. "If there is any waving to be done, do let us be the ones who wave," she said eagerly. But Mrs. Arbuthnot, as usual, held on to Mrs. Wilkins, and presently, having cooled down in the train, Mrs. Wilkins announced that at San Salvatore Mrs. Fisher would find her level. "I see her finding her level there," she said, her eyes very bright. Whereupon Mrs. Arbuthnot, sitting with her quiet hands folded, turned over in her mind how best she could help Mrs. Wilkins not to see quite so much, or at least, if she must see, to see in silence. Chapter 4. It had been arranged that Mrs. Arbuthnot and Mrs. Wilkins, traveling together, should arrive at San Salvatore on the evening of March 31st. The owner, who told them how to get there, appreciated their disinclination to begin their time in it on April 1st, and Lady Caroline and Mrs. Fisher, as yet unacquainted and therefore under no obligations to bore each other on the journey, for only towards the end would they find out by a process of sifting who they were to arrive on the morning of April 2nd. In this way, everything would be got nicely ready for the two who seemed, in spite of the equality of the sharing, yet to have something about them of guests. There were disagreeable incidents towards the end of March, when Mrs. Wilkins, her heart in her mouth and her face a mixture of guilt, terror, and determination, told her husband that she had been invited to Italy, and he declined to believe it. Of course he declined to believe it. Nobody had ever invited his wife to Italy before. There was no precedent. He required proofs. The only proof was Mrs. Arbuthnot, and Mrs. Wilkins had produced her, but after what entreaties, what passionate persuading! Mrs. Arbuthnot had not imagined she would have to face Mr. Wilkins and say things to him that were short of the truth, and it brought home to her what she had for some time suspected, that she was slipping more and more away from God. Indeed, the whole of March was filled with unpleasant, anxious moments. It was an uneasy month. Mrs. Arbuthnot's conscience, made supersensitive by years of pampering, could not reconcile what she was doing with its own high standard of what was right. It gave her little peace. It nudged her at her prayers. It punctuated her entreaties for divine guidance with disconcerting questions, such as, "Are you not a hypocrite? Do you really mean that? Would you not, frankly, be disappointed if that prayer were granted?" The prolonged, wet, raw weather was on the side, too, of her conscience, producing far more sickness than usual among the poor. They had bronchitis, they had fevers, there was no end to the distress. And here she was going off, spending precious money on going off, simply and solely to be happy. One woman being happy, and these piteous multitudes. She was unable to look the vicar in the face. He did not know, nobody knew, what she was going to do, and from the very beginning she was unable to look anybody in the face. She excused herself from making speeches appealing for money. How could she stand up and ask people for money when she herself was spending so much on her own selfish pleasure? Nor did it help her or quiet her that, having actually told Frederick, in her desire to make up for what she was squandering, that she would be grateful if he would let her have some money, he instantly gave her a check for £100. He asked no questions. She was scarlet. He looked at her a moment and then looked away. It was a relief to Frederick that she should take some money. She gave it all immediately to the organization she worked with and found herself more tangled in doubts than ever. Mrs. Wilkins, on the contrary, had no doubts. She was quite certain that it was a most proper thing to have a holiday, and altogether right and beautiful to spend one's own hard-collected savings on being happy. "Think how much nicer we shall be when we come back," she said to Mrs. Arbuthnot, encouraging that pale lady. No, Mrs. Wilkins had no doubts, but she had fears, and March was for her, too, an anxious month, with the unconscious Mr. Wilkins coming back daily to his dinner and eating his fish in the silence of imagined security. Also, things happened so awkwardly. It really is astonishing how awkwardly they happen. Mrs. Wilkins, who was very careful all this month to give Mellersh only the food he liked, buying it and hovering over its cooking with a zeal more than common, succeeded so well that Mellersh was pleased, definitely pleased. So much pleased that he began to think that he might, after all, have married the right wife instead of, as he had frequently suspected, the wrong one. The result was that on the third Sunday in the month, Mrs. Wilkins had made up her trembling mind that on the fourth Sunday, there being 5 in that March, and it being on the 5th of them that she and Mrs. Arbuthnot were to start, she would tell Mellersh of her invitation. On the third Sunday, then, after a very well-cooked lunch in which the Yorkshire pudding had melted in his mouth and the apricot tart had been so perfect that he ate it all, Mellersh, smoking his cigar by the brightly burning fire, the while hail gusts banged on the window, said, "I am thinking of taking you to Italy for Easter," and paused for her astounded and grateful ecstasy. None came. The silence in the room, except for the hail hitting the windows and the gay roar of the fire, was complete. Mrs. Wilkins could not speak. She was dumbfounded. The next Sunday was the day she had meant to break her news to him, and she had not yet even prepared the form of words in which she would break it. Mr. Wilkins, who had not been abroad since before the war, and was noticing with increasing disgust, as week followed week of wind and rain, the peculiar persistent vileness of the weather, had slowly conceived a desire to get away from England for Easter. He was doing very well in his business. He could afford a trip. Switzerland was useless in April. There was a familiar sound about Easter in Italy. To Italy he would go, and as it would cause comment if he did not take his wife, take her he must. Besides, she would be useful. A second person was always useful in a country whose language one did not speak for holding things, for waiting with the luggage. He had expected an explosion of gratitude and excitement. The absence of it was incredible. She could not, he concluded, have heard. Probably she was absorbed in some foolish daydream. It was regrettable how childish she remained. He turned his head. Their chairs were in front of the fire, and looked at her. She was staring straight into the fire, and it was no doubt the fire that made her face so red. "I am thinking," he repeated, raising his clear, cultivated voice and speaking with acerbity, for inattention at such a moment was deplorable, "of taking you to Italy for Easter. Did you not hear me?" Yes, she had heard him, and she had been wondering at the extraordinary coincidence. Really, most extraordinary. She was just going to tell him how she had been invited. A friend had invited her. Easter, too. Easter was in April, wasn't it? Her friend had a house there. In fact, Mrs. Wilkins, driven by terror, guilt, and surprise, had been more incoherent, if possible, than usual. It was a dreadful afternoon. Mellersh, profoundly indignant, besides having his intended treat coming back on him like a blessing to roost, cross-examined her with the utmost severity. He demanded that she refuse the invitation. He demanded that, since she had so outrageously accepted it without consulting him, she should write and cancel her acceptance. Finding himself up against an unsuspected, shocking rock of obstinacy in her, he then declined to believe she had been invited to Italy at all. He declined to believe in this Mrs. Arbuthnot, of whom till that moment he had never heard, and it was only when the gentle creature was brought round. With such difficulty, with such a desire on her part to throw the whole thing up rather than tell Mr. Wilkins less than the truth, and herself endorsed his wife's statements that he was able to give them credence. He could not but believe Mrs. Arbuthnot. She produced the precise effect on him that she did on tube officials. She hardly needed to say anything, but that made no difference to her conscience, which knew and would not let her forget that she had given him an incomplete impression. "Do you," asked her conscience, "see any real difference between an incomplete impression and a completely stated lie? God sees none." The remainder of March was a confused, bad dream. Both Mrs. Arbuthnot and Mrs. Wilkins were shattered. Try as they would not to, both felt extraordinarily guilty, and when on the morning of the 30th they did finally get off, there was no exhilaration about the departure, no holiday feeling at all. "We've been too good, much too good," Mrs. Wilkins kept on murmuring as they walked up and down the platform at Victoria, having arrived there an hour before they need have, and that's why we feel as though we're doing wrong. We're browbeaten. We're not any longer real human beings. Real human beings aren't ever as good as we've been. Oh, she clenched her thin hands. To think that we ought to be so happy now, here on the very station, actually starting, and we're not, and it's being spoilt for us just simply because we've spoilt them. What have we done? What have we done, I should like to know? She inquired of Mrs. Arbuthnot indignantly, except for once want to go away by ourselves and have a little rest from them. Mrs. Arbuthnot, patiently pacing, did not ask who she meant by them because she knew. Mrs. Wilkins meant their husbands, persisting in her assumption that Frederick was as indignant as Mellersh over the departure of his wife, whereas Frederick did not even know his wife had gone. Mrs. Arbuthnot, always silent about him, had said nothing of this to Mrs. Wilkins. Frederick went too deep into her heart for her to talk about him. He was having an extra bout of work, finishing another of those dreadful books, and had been away practically continually the last few weeks, and was away when she left. Why should she tell him beforehand? Sure as she so miserably was that he would have no objection to anything she did, she merely wrote him a note and put it on the hall table ready for him if and when he should come home. She said she was going for a month's holiday, as she needed a rest, and she had not had one for so long, and that Gladys, the efficient parlour-maid, had orders to see to his comforts. She did not say where she was going. There was no reason why she should. He would not be interested. He would not care. The day was wretched, blustering and wet. The crossing was atrocious, and they were very sick. But after having been very sick, just to arrive at Calais and not be sick was happiness, and it was there that the real splendor of what they were doing first began to warm their benumbed spirits. It got hold of Mrs. Wilkins first, and spread from her like a rose-colored flame over her pale companion. Mellersh at Calais, where they restored themselves with soles because of Mrs. Wilkins's desire to eat a sole Mellersh wasn't having. Mellersh at Calais had already begun to dwindle and seem less important. None of the French porters knew him. Not a single official at Calais cared a fig for Mellersh. In Paris there was no time to think of him because their train was late, and they only just caught the Turin train at the Gare de Lyon, and by the afternoon of the next day when they got into Italy, England, Frederick, Mellersh, the vicar, the poor, Hampstead, the club, Shoolbred, everybody and everything, the whole inflamed sore dreariness had faded to the dimness of a dream. Chapter 5. It was cloudy in Italy, which surprised them. They had expected brilliant sunshine. But never mind, it was Italy, and the very clouds looked fat. Neither of them had ever been there before. Both gazed out of the windows with rapt faces. The hours flew as long as it was daylight, and after that there was the excitement of getting nearer, getting quite near, getting there. At Genoa, it had begun to rain. Genoa. Imagine actually being at Genoa, seeing its name written up in the station just like any other name. At Nervi it was pouring, and when at last, towards midnight, for again the train was late, they got to Mezzago, the rain was coming down in what seemed solid sheets. But it was Italy. Nothing it did could be bad. The very rain was different. Straight rain, falling properly onto one's umbrella, not that violently blowing English stuff that got in everywhere, and it did leave off, and when it did, behold, the earth would be strewn with roses. Mr. Briggs, San Salvatore's owner, had said, "You get out at Mezzago, and then you drive." But he had forgotten what he amply knew, that trains in Italy are sometimes late, and he had imagined his tenants arriving at Mezzago at 8 o'clock and finding a string of flies to choose from. The train was 4 hours late, and when Mrs. Arbuthnot and Mrs. Wilkins scrambled down the ladder-like high steps of their carriage into the black downpour, their skirts sweeping off great pools of sooty wet because their hands were full of suitcases. If it had not been for the vigilance of Domenico, the gardener at San Salvatore, they would have found nothing for them to drive in. All ordinary flies had long since gone home. Domenico, foreseeing this, had sent his aunt's fly, driven by her son, his cousin, and his aunt and her fly lived in Castagneto, the village crouching at the feet of San Salvatore, and therefore, however late the train was, the fly would not dare come home without containing that which it had been sent to fetch. Domenico's cousin's name was Beppo, and he presently emerged out of the dark where Mrs. Arbuthnot and Mrs. Wilkins stood, uncertain what to do next after the train had gone on. For they could see no porter, and they thought from the feel of it that they were standing not so much on a platform as in the middle of the permanent way. Beppo, who had been searching for them, emerged from the dark with a kind of pounce, and talked Italian to them vociferously. Beppo was a most respectable young man, but he did not look as if he were, especially not in the dark, and he had a dripping hat slouched over one eye. They did not like the way he seized their suitcases. He could not be, they thought, a porter. However, they presently, from out of his streaming talk, discerned the words San Salvatore, and after that they kept on saying them to him, for it was the only Italian they knew, as they hurried after him, unwilling to lose sight of their suitcases. Stumbling across rails and through puddles out to where in the road a small high fly stood. Its hood was up, and its horse was in an attitude of thought. They climbed in, and the minute they were in, Mrs. Wilkins, indeed, could hardly be called in. The horse awoke with a start from its reverie and immediately began going home rapidly, without Beppo, without the suitcases. Beppo darted after him, making the night ring with his shouts, and caught the hanging reins just in time. He explained proudly, and as it seemed to him with perfect clearness, that the horse always did that, being a fine animal full of corn and blood, and cared for by him, Beppo, as if he were his own son, and the ladies must not be alarmed. He had noticed they were clutching each other, but clear and loud and profuse of words, though he was, they only looked at him blankly. He went on talking, however, while he piled the suitcases up round them, sure that sooner or later they must understand him, especially as he was careful to talk very loud and illustrate everything he said with the simplest elucidatory gestures. But they both continued only to look at him. They both, he noticed sympathetically, had white faces, fatigued faces, and they both had big eyes, fatigued eyes. They were beautiful ladies, he thought, and their eyes, looking at him over the tops of the suitcases, watching his every movement. There were no trunks, only numbers of suitcases, were like the eyes of the Mother of God. The only thing the ladies said, and they repeated it at regular intervals, even after they had started, gently prodding him as he sat on his box to call his attention to it, was, "San Salvatore?" And each time he answered vociferously, encouragingly, "Si, San Salvatore." "We don't know, of course, if he's taking us there," said Mrs. Arbuthnot at last in a low voice, after they had been driving, as it seemed to them, a long while. and had got off the paving stones of the sleep-shrouded town and were out on a winding road with what they could just see was a low wall on their left, beyond which was a great black emptiness and the sound of the sea. On their right was something close and steep and high and black. Rocks, they whispered to each other, huge rocks. No. We don't know, agreed Mrs. Wilkins, a slight coldness passing down her spine. They felt very uncomfortable. It was so late, it was so dark, the road was so lonely. Suppose a wheel came off, suppose they met fascisti, or the opposite of fascisti. How sorry they were now that they had not slept at Genoa and come on the next morning in daylight. But that would have been the 1st of April, said Mrs. Wilkins in a low voice. It is that now, said Mrs. Arbuthnot beneath her breath. So it is, murmured Mrs. Wilkins. They were silent. Beppo turned round on his box, a disquieting habit already noticed, for surely his horse ought to be carefully watched, and again addressed them with what he was convinced was lucidity, no patois, and the clearest explanatory movements. How much they wished their mothers had made them learn Italian when they were little. If only now they could have said, "Please sit round the right way and look after the horse." They did not even know what horse was in Italian. It was contemptible to be so ignorant. In their anxiety, for the road twisted round great jutting rocks, and on their left was only the low wall to keep them out of the sea should anything happen, they too began to gesticulate, waving their hands at Beppo, pointing ahead. They wanted him to turn round again and face his horse, that was all. He thought they wanted him to drive faster, and there followed a terrifying 10 minutes during which, as he supposed, he was gratifying them. He was proud of his horse, and it could go very fast. He rose in his seat, the whip cracked, the horse rushed forward, the rocks leaped towards them, the little fly swayed, the suitcases heaved, Mrs. Arbuthnot and Mrs. Wilkins clung. In this way they continued, swaying, heaving, clattering, clinging, till at a point near Castagneto there was a rise in the road, and on reaching the foot of the rise the horse, who knew every inch of the way, stopped suddenly, throwing everything in the fly into a heap, and then proceeded up at the slowest of walks. Beppo twisted himself round to receive their admiration, laughing with pride in his horse. There was no answering laugh from the beautiful ladies. Their eyes, fixed on him, seemed bigger than ever, and their faces against the black of the night showed milky. But here, at least, once they were up the slope, were houses. The rocks left off, and there were houses, the low wall left off, and there were houses, the sea shrunk away, and the sound of it ceased, and the loneliness of the road was finished. No lights anywhere, of course, nobody to see them pass, and yet Beppo, when the houses began, after looking over his shoulder and shouting, "Castagneto" at the ladies, once more stood up and cracked his whip, and once more made his horse dash forward. "We shall be there in a minute," Mrs. Arbuthnot said to herself, holding on. "We shall soon stop now," Mrs. Wilkins said to herself, holding on. They said nothing aloud, because nothing would have been heard above the whip-cracking and the wheel-clattering and the boisterous inciting noises Beppo was making at his horse. Anxiously they strained their eyes for any sight of the beginning of San Salvatore. They had supposed and hoped that after a reasonable amount of village, a medieval archway would loom upon them, and through it they would drive into a garden and draw up at an open, welcoming door, with light streaming from it, and those servants standing in it who, according to the advertisement, remained. Instead, the fly suddenly stopped. Peering out, they could see they were still in the village street, with small, dark houses each side, and Beppo, throwing the reins over the horse's back, as if completely confident this time that he would not go any farther, got down off his box. At the same moment, springing, as it seemed, out of nothing, a man and several half-grown boys appeared on each side of the fly and began dragging out the suitcases. "No, no, San Salvatore, San Salvatore," exclaimed Mrs. Wilkins, trying to hold on to what suitcases she could. "Si, si, San Salvatore," they all shouted, pulling. "This can't be San Salvatore," said Mrs. Wilkins, turning to Mrs. Arbuthnot, who sat quite still watching her suitcases being taken from her with the same patience she applied to lesser evils. She knew she could do nothing if these men were wicked men determined to have her suitcases. "I don't think it can be," she admitted, and could not refrain from a moment's wonder at the ways of God. Had she really been brought here, she and poor Mrs. Wilkins, after so much trouble in arranging it, so much difficulty and worry along such devious paths of prevarication and deceit, only to be? She checked her thoughts and gently said to Mrs. Wilkins, while the ragged youths disappeared with the suitcases into the night and the man with the lantern helped Beppo pull the rug off her, that they were both in God's hands. And for the first time on hearing this, Mrs. Wilkins was afraid. There was nothing for it but to get out. Useless to try to go on sitting in the fly repeating San Salvatore. Every time they said it, and their voices each time were fainter, Beppo and the other man merely echoed it in a series of loud shouts. If only they had learned Italian when they were little, if only they could have said, "We wish to be driven to the door." But they did not even know what door was in Italian. Such ignorance was not only contemptible, it was, they now saw, definitely dangerous. Useless, however, to lament it now. Useless to put off whatever it was that was going to happen to them by trying to go on sitting in the fly. They therefore got out. The two men opened their umbrellas for them and handed them to them. From this they received a faint encouragement, because they could not believe that if these men were wicked, they would pause to open umbrellas. The man with the lantern then made signs to them to follow him, talking loud and quickly, and Beppo, they noticed, remained behind. Ought they to pay him? Not, they thought, if they were going to be robbed and perhaps murdered. Surely on such an occasion one did not pay. Besides, he had not, after all, brought them to San Salvatore. Where they had got to was evidently somewhere else. Also, he did not show the least wish to be paid. He let them go away into the night with no clamor at all. This, they could not help thinking, was a bad sign. He asked for nothing because presently he was to get so much. They came to some steps. The road ended abruptly in a church and some descending steps. The man held the lantern low for them to see the steps. "San Salvatore," said Mrs. Wilkins once again, very faintly, before committing herself to the steps. It was useless to mention it now, of course, but she could not go down steps in complete silence. No medieval castle, she was sure, was ever built at the bottom of steps. Again, however, came the echoing shout, "See, San Salvatore." They descended gingerly, holding up their skirts, just as if they would be wanting them another time, and had not, in all probability, finished with skirts forever. The steps ended in a steeply sloping path, with flat stone slabs down the middle. They slipped a good deal on these wet slabs, and the man with the lantern, talking loud and quickly, held them up. His way of holding them up was polite. "Perhaps," said Mrs. Wilkins in a low voice to Mrs. Arbuthnot, "it is all right after all." "We're in God's hands," said Mrs. Arbuthnot again, and again Mrs. Wilkins was afraid. They reached the bottom of the sloping path, and the light of the lantern flickered over an open space with houses round three sides. The sea was the fourth side, lazily washing backwards and forwards on pebbles. "San Salvatore," said the man, pointing with his lantern to a black mass curved round the water like an arm flung about it. They strained their eyes. They saw the black mass, and on the top of it, a light. "San Salvatore?" they both repeated incredulously, for where were the suitcases, and why had they been forced to get out of the fly? See, San Salvatore. They went along what seemed to be a quay, right on the edge of the water. There was not even a low wall here, nothing to prevent the man with the lantern tipping them in if he wanted to. He did not, however, tip them in. Perhaps it was all right after all, Mrs. Wilkins again suggested to Mrs. Arbuthnot on noticing this, who this time was herself beginning to think that it might be, and said no more about God's hands. The flicker of the lantern danced along, reflected in the wet pavement of the quay. Out to the left, in the darkness and evidently at the end of a jetty, was a red light. They came to an archway with a heavy iron gate. The man with the lantern pushed the gate open. This time they went up steps instead of down, and at the top of them was a little path that wound upwards among flowers. They could not see the flowers, but the whole place was evidently full of them. It here dawned on Mrs. Wilkins that perhaps the reason why the fly had not driven them up to the door was that there was no road, only a footpath. That also would explain the disappearance of the suitcases. She began to feel confident that they would find their suitcases waiting for them when they got up to the top. San Salvatore was, it seemed, on the top of a hill, as a medieval castle should be. At a turn of the path they saw above them, much nearer now and shining more brightly, the light they had seen from the quay. She told Mrs. Arbuthnot of her dawning belief, and Mrs. Arbuthnot agreed that it was very likely a true one. Once more, but this time in a tone of real hopefulness, Mrs. Wilkins said, pointing upwards at the black outline against the only slightly less black sky, "San Salvatore." And once more, but this time comfortingly, encouragingly, came back the assurance, "See, San Salvatore." They crossed a little bridge over what was apparently a ravine, and then came a flat bit with long grass at the sides and more flowers. They felt the grass flicking wet against their stockings, and the invisible flowers were everywhere. Then up again, through trees, along a zigzag path with the smell all the way of the flowers they could not see. The warm rain was bringing out all the sweetness. Higher and higher they went in this sweet darkness, and the red light on the jetty dropped farther and farther below them. The path wound round to the other side of what appeared to be a little peninsula. The jetty and the red light disappeared. Across the emptiness on their left were distant lights. "Mezzigo," said the man, waving his lantern at the lights. "See," they answered, for they had by now learned see. Upon which the man congratulated them in a great flow of polite words, not one of which they understood, on their magnificent Italian. For this was Domenico, the vigilant and accomplished gardener of San Salvatore, the prop and stay of the establishment, the resourceful, the gifted, the eloquent, the courteous, the intelligent Domenico. Only they did not know that yet, and he did in the dark, and even sometimes in the light, look, with his knife-sharp, swarthy features and swift panther movements, very like somebody wicked. They passed along another flat bit of path with a black shape like a high wall towering above them on their right, and then the path went up again under trellises, and trailing sprays of scented things caught at them and shook raindrops on them, and the light of the lantern flickered over lilies, and then came a flight of ancient steps worn with centuries, and then another iron gate, and then they were inside, though still climbing a twisting flight of stone steps with old walls on either side, like the walls of dungeons, and with a vaulted roof. At the top was a wrought iron door, and through it shone a flood of electric light. "Ecco," said Domenico, lively, running up the last few steps ahead and pushing the door open. And there they were, arrived, and it was San Salvatore, and their suitcases were waiting for them, and they had not been murdered. They looked at each other's white faces and blinking eyes very solemnly. It was a wonderful moment. Here they were, in their medieval castle at last. Their feet touched its stones. Mrs. Wilkins put her arm round Mrs. Arbuthnot's neck and kissed her. "The first thing to happen in this house," she said softly, solemnly, "shall be a kiss." "Dear Lottie," said Mrs. Arbuthnot. "Dear Rose," said Mrs. Wilkins, her eyes brimming with gladness. Domenico was delighted. He liked to see beautiful ladies kiss. He made them a most appreciative speech of welcome, and they stood arm in arm, holding each other up, for they were very tired, blinking smilingly at him, and not understanding a word.